Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 3 of Side Dive. This is our weekly mini episode series where we jump on a random topic that will definitely somehow tie into future episodes or the overall episode format and how things are discussed. With all that said, it's your boy Practical. I'm here with the topic today of bands and artists' discographies, and we'll jump right in with that. Typically, bands will have a very long go at it in terms of putting music out and putting things like projects and EPs and, concert albums and DVDs and things of that nature to keep the longevity going. But it's not all about that stuff. While it helps their career, what really propels them for a long go of it is their album output. And with album output, you have to remain consistent. You have to remain relevant if you want that big money coming in, and if you don't and you're just a fan of the music, you're going to keep putting out albums for either reason. And obviously, any band who wants to make music for money is probably doing it for the wrong reasons in the beginning. I understand lots of bands go through that transition where they're not like that, but then they take the big contract deal, and album after album, they might be selling out to what people think or whatever to keep riding that wave. And that can either have extremely positive effects in their music or extremely negative fan crushing effects on their music. And no one likes to see a band fail. At least I don't. I think a lot of bands that make it or have made it have some sort of everlasting appeal or longevity that I would love to see keep going. But I don't want to see it cheapened in a way that, fucks the music up. Exactly. You don't want that. Because at the end of the day, you're looking for authenticity, you're looking for consistency, and sometimes as fans, we have unrealistic expectations of how things are going to turn out and how you're going to be able to stay relevant and keep churning out classic after classic and banger after banger. It's just really hard, and probably a lot harder than we as the listener even understands. But there are those bands that, they continue to put it out. They pump that shit out, and they're just banger after banger. And it really depends on opinion at the end of the day, but there are some universally understood ones, bands like Led Zeppelin and early Black Sabbath, the Ozzy years, up until a point, obviously. And then in the, the 90s, we had Faith Hill and Shania Twain. They were putting out banger after banger albums. You had Green Day in the early 90s up until maybe American Idiot, and then their fan base took a shift there. But you could argue they reached even higher levels because they're taking their formula or their shtick and throwing that huge mainstream polish on it and just going all in. And they probably wouldn't agree with that, with their mentality, but that's just the way it is. So having used those examples, let's jump right into the actual content of the episode. And that is, some discographies can be good, some can be bad, some can be terrible, some are truly inconsistent. But I, as a fan, usually end up loving kind of everything in a way. It depends on the band, obviously. Like we talked about Devil Wears Prada a couple episodes ago, or 2 episodes ago, and how I grew up listening to them, and that was part of a completely different rock era, and they kind of slowly fell off for me. It's like I hardcore appreciate their old shit, but as their new stuff progressed and I got older, I wasn't really still feeling them or vibing with it, or however you really want to say it. That just wasn't my experience with them going forward. But then there's bands like Deftones or, the Red Hot Chili Peppers or, it's hard to say. Korn is a band that I continue to love their output, uh, and it differs, and that doesn't mean there isn't some shit along the way, but I think that there are bands you stick with and there are bands you don't at the end of the day, and that's kind of my point. And it's not because that band sucks or that their later catalog is necessarily shit, even though sometimes I do feel that way and will express it that way. Again, honing back to what I said, it's really hard to do. It's really hard to be consistent. And in terms of classic discographies, they're fucking out there. They're definitely things that get overlooked sometimes, but when you step back and think about it, some are really short and some are really long. One of the shortest ones is probably, Dr. Dre, to bring up Dr. Dre, because at the end of the fucking day, he only has 2 episodes. And look, I know there are some of you out there trying to fucking curse your boy's name, but the fact of the fucking matter is the Aftermath is not a Dr. Dre studio album. It's an album compilation of artists from his label at the time that he is trying to promote and put their name out there. And then Compton, that album is a companion piece / soundtrack to Straight Outta Compton, the NWA biographical story in which he was involved. So that's also not a real album. So when you strip those other 2 commonly brought up things back, and you say, fuck Wikipedia, because I know Wikipedia puts Compton there, it's fucking not the 3rd album. Dre has also said that himself in interviews. Fucking look it up. But anyway, Chronic and 2001. Chronic is Dre out the gate, just establishing a name for himself as a solo artist, coming hot off the heels of the NWA. And then the follow-up, 2001, is him jumping out there with this new label mate or, co-signer, Eminem at the time. He discovered him, he put him out there, fucking helped him blow up a second time, and he put out another banger classic, an album, that consists of a lot of guest artists like Exhibit, Snoop Dogg, Eminem, Nate Dogg, the works, and the production is fantastic. And that proves that Dre had that longevity, even if it is only 2 albums. Now, on the other side of that token, is that fair to bring it up? Yes, because sometimes an artist has a hard time with their sophomore album, and Dre quite literally destroyed that expectation. So we'll bring up other bands like Radiohead. I'm not a huge fan of Radiohead, but I know in the music listening community, lots of people love Radiohead and think that their discography is probably one of the most solid in rock history. And that's fine. I respect Radiohead. I respect their fans, even though I did say fuck them. Because for me personally, in my music taste, I say fuck them. But that doesn't mean that they're garbage. That just means they're not for me. But that's not how I express myself, so fuck. But they're a great example. Album after album, their fans are very pleased. Even if it's up until a point, you have a good chunk. It's usually for a lot of bands, again, they're not remembered after their debut and sophomore releases. They don't stick around to even have the longevity of this conversation. Other than the really big bands, which this isn't about really big bands. This going forward will be always about just their entire works, because sometimes they got sleeper hits in there too. They'll be forgotten, but as a band, they keep going with their output and they'll put out some sleepers, Things that come to mind for me are like the Gorillaz. They started strong. First album and Demon Days are fucking great albums. Plastic Beach is pretty good. And then, we waited a pretty long time for Humans to come out. I think it was called the 4th album. And that one was disappointing or polarizing to a lot of people, but I really liked it. And it did get a lot of acclaim, but I think that was from newer listeners and not so much longtime listeners. At least from the feedback I saw at the time. And I think that's kind of playing into what I'm talking about. They fell off for a lot of people. I did myself love Humans, but I did recognize a kind of shift in the sound to be more modernized, and it took a few listens to really get into it. And I think since then the Gorillaz have kind of been largely hit or miss. So then they come back around with their most recent effort, which name fucking escapes me right now. Yeah, well, it's gonna happen a lot because I fucking forget shit. I used to be that guy that was on top of everything and could fucking remember every goddamn thing I was trying to talk about at the moment, but I smoke a lot of weed and I've fallen off in that regard. But I do try to do a lot of research before our episodes, re-listen to everything, and hit everything on the head, but sometimes that just doesn't happen. Anyway, moving on to what I'm saying on the whole is writing a consistent discography is difficult. And the examples of which I think need to be explored are bands like Sum 41 or more slept on bigger acts like Oingo Boingo at the time or the RX Bandits. Some things that may not be widely known to everybody else, but are true bangers, like album after album. They're just putting it out there. Or again, if you want to spin back to bigger bands, Megadeth, their output is usually pretty consistent. Primus, Coheed and Cambria, those bands I think carve out their niche fan base so much better than surface level bands like Three Doors Down and Mudvayne. And when I say service level, I don't mean insulting wise to either of those bands. I actually really love Mudvayne and really like a handful of albums by Three Doors Down as well. So I'm not saying that in a negative way, but there are those bands that kind of precede themselves in a way where they have a shtick at their live shows. Like Primus is a good one. They'll say Primus sucks. And some people that don't know about that will think you're talking shit, but that's a thing started by the band as a joke. Primus sucks. It's just something you say. It really means like, fuck yeah, Primus kind of thing. But there's a lot of that. And then you'll get to artists like Michael Jackson, who wrote a lot of his biggest hits himself, and contrary to popular belief, that is true. If you look up Michael Jackson, there's videos of him talking about writing Beat It and having him beatboxing it on tape before he took it to the studio, and he basically composed all of that shit in his head and then just conveyed it to the people playing instruments for him, and he pumped out all these classics because he had that mind. Or Prince, same thing. But Prince was more of an actual musician, so he could play that stuff on the guitar and the keyboards. And where Michael was a little bit more limited, he did still write everything, but in a different way. And I admire that kind of shit, because the people like MJ and Prince, who do have really consistent discographies, they both reinvented the wheel for themselves each time, but also tried to keep a firm grasp on what was up and coming and popular, and found a way to fit into that sound and era for the time. And I think that's what makes a lot of discographies timeless. And there are so many examples of bands who start super strong, or artists like Elton John, where he's known for his classics, Man Man Across the Water, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, fucking Tumbleweed Connection. I could go on. His 70s output is fantastic, and it's not that his later work sucks, but it starts to be kind of commonplace. So you'll find gems throughout, but eventually, as every album drops, it's less and less about that one had no skips. It's more of a cherry picker, and then that diminishes said discography. And it's a tale as old as time. It happens to lots of bands, and I fucking said it. Because I myself am a big fan of lots of full discographies, but I'm also constantly saying, well, their early shit's really good. Their early shit was they were thirsty, they were hungry to hit the scene, to make a name for themselves, and then as time progresses, third, fourth album in, it starts to get really boring. Bands like Stained or bands like what's another good example from that time period, like Theory of a Dead Man, things like that. It doesn't even have to be from that time period. There is that for a lot of bigger acts, like the Grateful Dead. Their output was great for a while, but they start churning out so many albums, that's when things start to get hazy. And again, like I said, in defense of it, it's definitely hard, and I don't think we as the viewer get that, or the viewer or listener get how hard it is. But that's what's great about bringing in those outside sources, production people like Rick Rubin, like Dr. Dre. There we talked about what's his name for the Of Mice and Men shit, Joey Sturgis for the metalcore scene. He had a lot of influence on the overall sound of that era, and that kind of happens everywhere. We have that a lot with Ross Robinson with like Slipknot, and they'll bring those guys in and they'll get a sound out of a band or an artist that they may not have the next time. And sometimes that doesn't land, and that's kind of what I mean when sometimes discographies can be terrible, because we forget about the things that go into that and what makes their career what it is, and maybe sometimes turmoil. Like if you're a band like Deftones, they've put out a lot of albums, changed a lot of times, made albums in the midst of band turmoil. And the Beatles, they did the same thing. The turmoil started early on, and then you could kind of hear it progress in the music. And then we have this person writing this song, and I get to perform this one per album. It's not all about John and Paul. That's another tale as old as time. So with all that said, I just kind of wanted to ramble on a little bit about discographies and how we're going to talk about discographies. And what that basically breaks itself down into is, I'm not going to love every album by a band, but I'll still usually find things about it I like. We'll bring up Metallica pretty often because I know I'm a big Metallica fan, and I think Rex really likes a lot of their shit, and they're usually the benchmark for a rock band that's gone through a lot of changes. So that's why they get brought up so much. But I'll bring up Saint Anger. I hated that album at the time. I'm still not overly fond of it and would put it closer to being one of their worst. But I do still like a lot of songs on it, enough to think that it still counts and is good in their discography. And one of my philosophies that you'll often see is you got to take the good with the bad. You can't be a band or an artist for 30-something years and expect everything to be fucking gold, because at the end of the day, it's just not realistic, But there are, like we mentioned with Dr. Dre and Radiohead and Led Zeppelin and Michael Jackson, things like that. There are artists that will put out good shit every time. And when I bring up Dr. Dre, you might be like, well, how's it fair? Because Dr. Dre has the good grace to make that call at the studio floor and say, I'm not going to put this out. He infamously had, the Detox. We all waited for that shit for years, and it never surfaced because he wasn't comfortable with it. Or Limp Bizkit and Stampede of the Disco Elephants. He was not happy with it. And you can love or hate Limp Bizkit or whatever, but the artist gets the final call there. And he himself just wasn't feeling it. And the same thing goes with Dr. Dre. He isn't feeling what he recorded, so he isn't just going to put anything out just to put it out. So that's what preserves his legacy and makes those two albums a classic discography. And that pretty much wraps it up. I could probably ramble about that all day, but I really wanted to jump in here and talk about that in particular. because again, it's one of the biggest reasons that I created Deep Dive was so that we could maintain a positive, long-lasting relationship with the art and the culture around us that's been around for a very long time, from the early doo-wop days all the way to modern music on the whole. And it doesn't matter whether we love it or hate it, we need to discuss it. It's always something that is important as a group to throw your opinions around and share new ideas. And I think that's important. And if you hate something that I've talked about or you love it, I want to hear from you. I want to hear it on the Twitter. I want to hear it on Facebook. Comment below our YouTube videos. Our videos themselves will be coming soon, but for now, we're just a podcast. And once we get that camera, we'll hook you up. It's been nice chatting with you in this hump day, midday stretch till Friday. In which case, we'll be talking about acclaimed director David Fincher, who is obviously the director of huge hits like Seven, Fight Club, Zodiac, Gone Girl, fucking you name it, The dude, he's made a lot of shit. So Rex and I are going to talk about all that. We'll catch you on Friday. Thank you for tuning in to Deep Dive Side Dive, Episode 3, Discographies. It's your boy Prack. I'm out.